Welcome to the Learning Cosmos podcast. I'm your host, André Hedlund, educational psychologist, author, geek, and nerd. This show brings you science and learning through conversations with stellar people from different fields. Put on your spacesuits and hold tight. Our voyage into the learner's universe begins now. All right, everyone. So welcome to another episode of the Learning Cosmos podcast. And I could not feel more privileged today because I have Robert Bjork and his wife, Elizabeth Bjork. I actually refer to you guys as the super science of learning couple when I'm teaching, because I teach a lot of educators in Brazil and the world. And, we use your work so often that you guys are the super science of learning couple. So thank you so much for accepting my invitation.
We did run, what was the net title of that one article we did? One of the journals did an article on professional couples working together. And I think we called ours.
They called us Dynamic Duo, I think.
Okay, Dynamic Duo. Okay.
Freedom, Flexibility, and Never Finished was what the title was. And the idea of that was, the academic world gives you a lot of flexibility and freedom, but it also imposes this thing that you are never finished. So
that is
the end
true.
of the day, at the end of whatever, you go home with work and so on. But anyway,
yes,
we're not really complaining.
Okay. And I think that somehow ties in with my first question. I think the most important question about science. So why science? And let me give you some context. I know a lot of people are attacking science right now. A lot of educators feel maybe a little threatened by science. They say that, scientists, they want to dictate what we have to do in the classroom. So why is science important?
Well, it's critically important why people don't think it is an interesting question. I mean, and it is kind of unusual that in different domains people really trust the science. I mean, at least most people assume what their doctor or physician or whatever has to tell them is more important than what some next door neighbor would tell them. But I'm not sure why then in some other domains, people, it relates to our work in the sense that we did quite a few things showing that, research showing what people's habits and their beliefs and so on are really misguided. If your goal is to optimize your own learning, your children's learning and so on, it's easy to be misguided by some assumptions about how your whole memory system works. And I think Elizabeth and I spent a lot of our career trying to emphasize all the ways that humans as learners differ from any kind of recording device.
Yeah.
That it's not.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Elizabeth.
Well, I was just going to say not just a recording device, but a lot of different like computers and so forth like that human learning system in a way is much more complicated, but also more creative and more flexible.
Precisely. And that really brings me to the next question. So how can we define learning? What is learning?
Well, it amounts to a change in kind of connections between things and so on that leads you to have a understanding of something you didn't have earlier. So, I mean, it can be in a lot of domains, of course. We can be learning people's names. We could be learning how to drive from some place to someplace else. And so there's learning's happening at different levels of all types all the time. And it then becomes very fundamental to know when, particularly when learning is important, how to facilitate it. And, one of the things is people think, students in particular often think that repeatedly going over if it's a written material, repeatedly going over it will somehow write, or if they've got a video or audio representation of lectures, play it over and over again. But to be really effective, you have to sort of interact with it and exercise what we've sometimes called the output side. The input of just kind of trying to get it to write yourself is not as powerful as when you yourself produce something. That creates a much longer lasting and richer kind of representation in the brain when you produced it or connected different things in terms of their relationships and so on.
And as Professor Elizabeth said, it's not a computer, it's not a recorder. So is it fair to say that what we think works for learning doesn't really work as much as we think in general? As people think, well, I should do this to learn more effectively, but it's not what the science is telling us, right?
Well, that's often true. One problem is that a lot of what we do on our own is, as Bob says, we just repeatedly input the information we want to learn into ourselves. And that's reinforcing because it looks like I'm learning. Oh yeah, this all seems very familiar to me now. I've got it. But then when you have to, at some later time, call upon that information and use it, perhaps in a new setting, you realize I really don't have that. It's like a lot of people say I kind of bombed, or I just couldn't think of what I knew. I knew this stuff, but I couldn't actually answer any of these questions that make you use a slightly different, call upon you to use a slightly different way, not just regurgitating what you've learned, but applying it to a new problem, a new related problem that has to be approached in some different way. So I think that is, sometimes we say input less and output more.
Exactly.
As a way to learn better. You can't just trust this feeling, I've got it, until you actually test yourself at some later time. And then that gives you a truer measure of whether you have got it, in the sense that I can call upon that information whenever I need it, versus just this feeling that when I'm looking at it, I can recognize it. Oh yes, I know this, I've seen this before.
Yeah, it's kind of when you read something that you want to learn, a student or something, you read over it again a second or third time, you can confuse the fluency. It will, in fact, be read more fluently, and that feeling of fluency you can confuse with achieving a level of understanding or storage of information that will support it later. It's a kind of misleading guide. And we sometimes, reckon, oh, I was just studying that last night. We can kind of recognize that I should be drawing on this, but we never really encode it in a way that makes it retrieval on the long term.
Exactly. And that's why I remember watching a lecture that you delivered, Professor Bjork, about the difference between performance and learning. And could you please tell us a little bit about that?
Well, it's one of the oldest and in some ways, one of the most oldest robust distinctions. Goes back to animal researchers, 1930s and 40s. And that's that learning, appropriate measure of learning is when that happens, it increases the ability long term. That's almost what you mean by it, is I've accomplished something that will let me recall it later. It's part of my apparatus, if you want to use a crude term. Yeah. But you can confused that with performance, and this could be the single topic of this whole session today, actually.
Yes.
Is because you can really, what's almost sinister, if you think of it a certain way, is that learning skills and other things, many things that will enhance performance during the process,
Yeah.
massing practice, giving yourself various cues, and so on. Those very same things that will enhance performance during the study period
Yeah.
are not the things that will enhance your recall or use of that information when you really need it at a later time. So that was part of the making things hard on yourself, but in a good way.
Yeah. Is it fair for me to say that in other words, if you get an A on a test, it doesn't mean that you have actually learned, the content. If
Yeah,
you
well,
get tested on that a week later or
yeah,
even a couple of days later, you might not remember much, right? Yeah.
yeah. I mean, it depends on the nature of the test or something, but what's really unreliable is just students during the study process itself using some sense of familiarity, for example, as a measure that they've learned it, or even looking at, students sometimes where in certain domains there's problem sets that then show the solution at the back of the book. Going over those solutions can give you a sense that you understand everything. But when you got to produce a solution a few days later on an exam, there's this sinking feeling, and so
Yeah.
that's one way that just kind of survey research shows that students, in fact, will go to the answers before trying to produce the answers with the
Yeah.
idea that it will be more efficient, but it is a big mistake.
And how do you feel about the idea of facilitating learning? Because I think this is the narrative that people have been spreading, promoting all over the place. You have to facilitate learning. You have to make learning easier for the student. But that goes against what your research says, right?
Yeah, I mean, we think over the years that we've facilitated a lot of students learning, but it's not by providing them with some easy to assimilate
Yeah.
characterization of it, but to in fact try to teach good habits. And we have to remind ourselves, actually, when we're even at this late stage in our careers, have to remind ourselves that if this is something we want to learn, there needs to be a production side of it is crucial, so it can be. We're in an environment now, a retirement environment now, where there's a lot of programs to work on skills ranging from pickleball to bridge to chess to whatever. And
Yeah. Even language learning, right?
yes,
Yeah.
oh, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, language learning is a really good example in many ways because of how important it is to understand relationships between languages, how important it is to be producing. Often I don't know if the evidence is totally convincing, but there's some indication that children can become pretty good in second language because of willingness to produce it, even if
Yeah.
it's not sure they're pronouncing it correctly. Adults can be inhibited by, afraid of having a certain accent or afraid they'll mispronounce. But without the production side, learning will not be efficient at all.
Yeah.
There's a sort of a idea out there
Yeah.
that if you don't learn a language by the age of 8, you're never going to become proficient in that language. And I think a lot of that feeling is that when you're learning a language as a child, you're producing it. You know, you want that apple, and so you're trying to convey to the parent or the teacher or whoever that you want that apple. So you have to say that. And if I say, the wrong thing, I'm going to be corrected
Yeah.
by that adult. We feel perfectly fine to correct a child who's struggling with trying to retrieve a word or matching, nouns to the verb and that sort of thing. But with an adult who's trying to learn a new language, nobody corrects them. Nobody forces them to correct their errors.
Yeah. Unless they go to a language school, right? And they have a proper teacher. Yeah.
To a language, school. Yeah. So I think that's one thing that makes it much harder for an adult to get an active possession of a new language, whereas with kids, because we lose that, people constantly saying, no, it's not "ers," it's "horse."
Yeah.
Making us come out with "horse" rather than "hers" or something like that.
Exactly. So actually producing language is very important for you to learn.
Yes.
And that's a little harder. It's harder than just being passive,
Yes.
passively receiving things. And how does that relate to the idea of desirable difficulties? Because you both mentioned, hard, struggling. It's actually good for us to add certain difficulties in this learning and teaching process, right?
Yes.
So can you explain to us what,
particularly difficulties that make produce, try to produce, try to solve a problem with that new knowledge or relate it to some other context and so forth.
Yeah. So is it okay for me to say that if something is too easy, I might not be learning at all? I might actually, maybe I already know that, or maybe I'm not doing it right. So for anyone to learn anything, there has to be some kind of struggle, a little bit, for you to actually build those connections in the brain. Yeah?
I think that's right. And in a way, that's a problem because we feel like we're learning.
Yeah.
When we repeat something over and over again. And so we have to, learn how to mistrust that feeling. This seems familiar to me. I think I know it. I don't have to study this again. I don't have to try to answer questions about it. That feeling of familiarity can be very misguiding you.
Yeah, and I think somewhat, it's Elizabeth may have to correct me on this, but there's an interesting thing with was it Richard Feynman at Caltech or a very prominent scientist, but really people are dying to get into his classes. Super entertaining and so on. And and someone at some point compared the final exam performance of his students and students in the other classes.
Yeah.
And they were not doing as well. And so eager. I mean, we've never been completely sure how rigorous that was, but the point I think is that you can be entertaining and engaging as a teacher in ways that are not going to be consistent with you yourself producing, generalizing, and so on. It seems like a kind of compelling story that you just listen to and don't have to produce on your own part.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned Feynman because he came to Brazil in the 60s, I think.
Oh, really?
Yeah, wow. He was a guest lecturer at the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro, and I think he wrote a very interesting account of what happened because he said Brazilian students, they had memorized verbatim, everything. But when you asked them to actually apply the knowledge, they couldn't, because they hadn't learned. They had memorized superficially, definitions of different concepts that he was working on, but they couldn't really apply that knowledge. And I think that's a very interesting illustration of what we're discussing here. Maybe they should have experienced some desirable difficulties to actually learn better what they were studying, right?
And some things seem sometimes some things are relatively simple to impose with. I mean, working together cooperatively, a couple kids going over, one you ask a question, the other kid tries to answer it, and then those interactive activities, they will exercise just about all the processes that create long-term learning. So there's the collaborative aspect, something to take more advantage of in terms of creating it if you're an instructor, but also as a student. And
we've done some research showing so one procedure for teaching that seems to gain quite a bit of popularity among teachers is you give a test, and then sometimes later you have students take that same test again. And what we did in one of the big classes there at UCLA was to use that method, but on the second time through this test, that you took it first by yourself and for a grade. Now you're having to go over it again with either by yourself or with somebody else.
Oh, okay.
And what we found was then later on a final exam, the students that had gone over those tests with somebody else did much better on that final exam than the students who went over it by themselves. And again, we also found, though, you have to sort of prescribe how they're going to go when the students are working together, how they're going to answer these questions.
Yeah.
So do you get a discussion going? One student doesn't just take over and say, oh, I know the answer to that, and so and so. Everybody has to answer the questions first. Then they have to share
Perfect.
their answers and why. Say if it's a multiple choice question, why did they pick C rather than B? Whereas the student who was so confident had picked B. And you get those kind of discussions going. And it seems to be a lot of learning takes place in that sort of context.
Yeah, and by allowing them to answer first, they're actually retrieving that information. So they're not.
yes,
So that's very important. That's a desirable difficulty, right?
Yeah.
absolutely. Yeah.
Right.
And I was talking to Henry Roediger a couple of weeks ago, and he.
Oh, good.
Yeah, and such an amazing person, and his work is also great. And I was talking a little bit about desirable difficulties, and he said something funny. Not all difficulties are desirable, right? So he said, well, if you're going to read a book upside down, that's probably not desirable. That's not going to help you learn. So what makes a difficulty desirable?
Yeah, a very good question, and that's one to take very seriously if you're a teacher, because for example, we've talked about the power of retrieval practice, that if you can get some retrieval, that it will be far better recalled later than if people just go over it. But if you think of a teacher in a class, given the differences in students' background and current understanding, they'll all profit from retrieval practice, but some students will need much more cues to produce. They're at a level of understanding and stuff that they need more cues and a more well-defined or narrower kind of question to come up with it. They all profit from retrieval practice, but people don't profit from just the failure. And so some of the things we admire very much about teachers in early grades who can kind of manage to have all the students in their classes profit, because given what's happening in their family,
Yeah.
in terms of kind of instructions or experiences that are relevant, they can be a very different stage of their understanding of different topics in those early grades. And how you have a class of 30 students or something and try to make it work for all those students.
Yeah, not an easy job, huh?
Yeah, and
Yes.
sometimes that involves projects of getting students together,
Yeah.
where then anyway, but it's quite a challenge.
Yeah.
We
we
visited that.
Go ahead, Elizabeth.
Well, I was just going to say, we visited that math class that somebody in England was teaching. And this was Emily's class that he was teaching. I think it was fourth graders. I'm not sure. I can't remember quite. But he had them in groups, like Bob was suggesting. And they didn't get credit for answering the question unless every student could answer it in that group correctly. So if it was a math problem, there'd always be, one kid who knew exactly how to solve it and would solve it. But they knew that until Johnny, who didn't know how to solve it right just yet, learned how to solve it, they would not get, they wouldn't be able to go on to the next thing. And that seemed to be working very effectively in creating this environment where the students were all willing to try to answer a question and not be embarrassed if their answer was wrong, but sort of treated it as a learning experience for everybody else. And because, you might have said, oh, I thought that was the right answer too. But I guess and then I'm going to listen now to what the teacher has to say about this. I think this is the same kind of thing that we found with pretesting.
Yep.
So if you give a test on the material that you're about to teach, students realize, oh, I thought I knew all about volcanoes and how they worked, but I guess I don't. Or they come up with something that's completely wrong. And then when they hear the teacher go over the correct way to either do a problem or whatever it is, they're more attentive. They seem to learn it better. And on a much later, again, it's this much later exam that you've got to always use to make sure your students have learned. Then they do better than the students who didn't take such a pretest.
Interesting. And this is, I think, related to the idea that you make the conditions more difficult, slightly more difficult, not the content itself, right? And this is based on the idea of the testing effect, just like retrieval practice and the pre-testing. So you test yourself to make sure you know, other than rely on your sense of fluency. And, well, I know this because I did it yesterday, but do you really? So tell me, show me you know, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And you don't really know.
Yeah.
Unless you let some time go by and you try to retrieve it again now in a
Exactly.
different room, a different context, or whatever. And I thought I really had that, but maybe I didn't. And you go back and you look at it again. And now you actually look at it from a slightly different perspective. And that second exposure seems to be a very effective one in terms of helping you learn.
And people's instincts are often so wrong. Like in the skills domains, I'm an avid golfer, and I've talked to professional teachers, many talks on how principles learning would apply to optimizing the teaching and execution of golf. But at one point, I had said everybody does things wrong on the driving range. They
Yeah.
hit the same club over and over again a few seconds apart. That'll never happen on the course itself. Everything's from a flat lie. They admire the ball when they hit a good shot, but they don't actually know if it's at the target. They line themselves up with the lines on the practice pad, and so I had said that to some reporter, and then he arranged that we would meet at a driving range near the Los Angeles airport.
Okay.
And he just asked myself and another motor skills friend and motor skills researcher, Richard Schmidt, and I to comment on what we saw. But it was amazing how we didn't, these were just the people doing, but they would but ball after ball, never at a different target, don't switch the clubs, but the game itself requires hitting different clubs, different distances with your left foot lower than your right foot, the right foot lower to the side, and that's golf, but there are other, in most all other sports, to some degree, in the kind of academic topics we're talking about.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we also gave a talk at the Cleveland Indians. I think they're not called Cleveland Indians anymore, but the Cleveland baseball team. And these were all professionals or students who were trying to get into
They were minor league players trying to become major league players.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
major league. They were
At the Cleveland training facility.
Okay.
And they had so many machines there to help them do things. And one is you could set this machine that pitched to you.
Yeah.
And you could set it to do a pitch that would be considered a strike pitch by the umpire, straight over the base, high or low. And then you could also set it to do a kind of a random.
Yeah.
A curveball or a change
So
up.
you wouldn't know what was
So
coming
they
at
wouldn't
you.
expect, they wouldn't know what to expect. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, it could be
Yeah.
a low ball, it could be a curve, it could be, et cetera.
Yeah.
And but when the students were left to their own devices, they all set it on the fast strikes, or fast strike
Down the middle.
Yeah.
And
straight over the base.
we could hardly believe our eyes that they were just
And do it
not.
over and over and over and over. And we
And
finally
what they
Yeah.
what they said was they wanted to work on their swing. Like,
Yeah.
if I know what the pitch is going to be, I can try to. But I mean, that is so far away.
It
but
is.
what happens in a real game?
Yeah.
You know-
So you have to replicate the real game conditions, and I think,
they would have a second thought and say, "Oh,
yeah.
yeah."
Yeah, I think during your lecture, I watched this lecture. I actually asked my students to watch. You've mentioned something related to tennis, forehand, backhand serve. And then
yes.
people, when they try the same movement over and over, they actually rate their precision, their accuracy higher, but it's the other way around, right? So that has to do with interleaving, right?
Yeah,
Exactly.
they get a machine and shows the same thing over and over again. Yeah, I mean it's very easy to get misled, and it's somewhat surprising to see pretty high level people
Yeah.
in terms of the levels they've reached in their skills to construct practice in a non-optimal way. We also did a lot of work with a soccer in England, what they call football, of course,
Yeah.
but he's working with junior level kids and so on, and he accomplished a great deal by intermixing. Before we talked to him, all the kids would line up and practice a penalty kick, or they would line up and practice throwing the ball in from the sidelines.
Yeah.
And, so we went over this, and then he constructed it so that practice had more interleaving. They weren't just doing. And a funny thing there that we didn't anticipate is it made practice much more interesting to the kids.
Of course, yeah.
and lively. And
It
so
stopped
he
being
said
boring, right?
the kids
You're
are
trying the
showing
same
up.
thing over and over again. It's
Yeah,
kind of
kids are
boring.
showing up more on
Yeah.
time. They're happier, like we didn't anticipate that necessarily, but he was very impressed with that.
Yeah.
And
And I have a question about interleaving because, usually when we look at the research, you're talking about procedural memory, sports and things like that. What about semantic memory, like actually learning concepts in, let's say, I don't know, a geography lesson?
yeah,
Can we apply the same desirable difficulty there?
I think so. I mean, one of the most well-known studies that we were involved in is had to do with learning the styles of different painters.
Oh yes, yeah. Van
And
Gogh
so,
and yeah,
yes,
remember that?
and
Yeah.
and and there was one of the most pronounced examples of people rating, when asked to rate how efficient some schedule was for their learning, they're just literally wildly off. So if they had to learn in an interleaved way about the different artists, then their ability later, when shown new paintings, to say which of the studied artists painted it was far better. But even after
Wow.
they performed better on that, at the very end of the experiment, we asked, what helped you learn better? Having them all blocked or having them interleaved? And about 90% of the students said blocked.
Yeah.
Their own, it was so extreme, almost shocking that the blocking gives a sense of familiarity and so on, and the interleaving is, you
Yeah.
know, switching these artists and they're different, and it seems kind of confusing, but in terms of long-term outcome, substantial benefits of
And
interleaving.
yeah, does that mean that if we're studying for an exam, for example, we shouldn't block? Let's say we're studying for, I don't know, like teenagers, they often have to take an exam on different subject areas, and so it would
Yep,
actually be better for them to mix those and not block and study just one subject. So
Yeah.
let's say English and geography and arts, for example,
yeah,
that would be better. Yeah.
for sure. And
Yeah.
there's even some indications that maybe at a very kind of physiological level, the switching now to different topic can kind of re-alert you, so to speak.
Yeah.
We're all familiar with that. Even 20 minutes of serious studying is, if you can sustain your efficiency, you're doing very well, because we almost automatically start to daydream and worry about something we got to do later in the day.
Yeah.
But there's something about the switching that kind of reactivates things. And so, you know, students often think they're being well organized if they know they got a couple of final exams in a course, tomorrow. They think it's organized to spend one period of time studying the one and another studying the other, where
Yeah.
wouldn't even consider kind of interleaving, going back and forth. But the research has shown some large benefits in experimental study of interleaving.
Yeah, that's incredible, and most people don't know that. That's
No,
that's what's funny because you ask any student here in Brazil, anywhere in the world, they will tell you that they feel that they know exactly how to study well, and then when you look at the science, it's not like that. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, and then it is interesting that over the years, we've talked about these kind of results and issues in classes where they're relevant, and very often then we get later there's sort of testimonials, so students come in just or sometimes we interact with them at graduation ceremonies or something like that, and they talk about what a difference it made to kind of modify, because Elizabeth and I have argued that in addition to being more effective, it can be more time efficient.
Exactly.
So a student going over the same thing again and again and maybe dozing off periodically the amount of profit, so to speak, per unit time can be quite
Yeah.
low. So they may ultimately reach a pretty high level, but at the cost of a very large investment of time. And so that
So
students
it's
are
not cost
somewhat,
effective, right? Yeah.
yeah, they're
Yeah.
somewhat receptive to that argument.
But there's
Just,
a real problem of how to motivate both teachers and students to adopt these desirable difficulty into their studying, into their teaching. And part of it is you just seem so much more organized if you're blocking things. You know,
Yeah.
we're going to do, like if you're a math teacher, we're going to all learn how to solve the volume of a cube today. And so you do problem after problem that. And then next day you say, now we're going to volume of a cone, and you do many problems after that. And then, and you also give student homework problems, workbooks. They're all organized that way. So it only makes sense that that's what students are used to. And if you're asking them to do something different, it seems, wait a minute, this is not how my past teachers have told me how to learn.
It's counterintuitive, right? It feels like it's
Yeah.
wrong.
Counterintuitive. And
Yeah.
it's like it's hard for people to trust that this is really going to work. Because the same thing, that, like the people in the painting experiments, learning the styles of different painters, when the people that go through the interleaving think, oh, I wasn't learning anything. This was just so confusing.
Yeah.
But in reality, that's where they're learning most effectively.
yeah, I mean, if this is the fourth problem in a row that relies on the Pythagorean theorem, you have a very big advantage to know what you're supposed to draw on.
Yeah.
But on the exam, where things are going to be mixed up, a critical thing may be the ability to see that it's a situation where the Pythagorean theorem is relevant. That it won't,
Yeah.
it very likely that it won't tell you, use the Pythagorean theorem to solve this. They'll just give you a kind of word problem. And a key thing is to know, to realize that this is a situation where the Pythagorean theorem would let you determine something like how
What
long,
kind of strategy do I need to solve this problem?
how
And
long,
workbooks, that's all been made for you already. You did 30
Yeah.
questions, 30 problems in a row, all using simultaneous equations, 30 in a row that all use Pythagorean theory.
And that gives you a sense of fluency, right? After
Yes.
you got it, you know you have to
Exactly.
use the same strategy over and over, and that doesn't happen on an exam
You're
because it's all
missing
mixed.
learning
Yeah.
what may be the most critical thing, as Bob was saying, learning what from all the different equations I've learned, or ways to solve the problems I've learned, which one now applies to this particular problem that I haven't seen before? And you haven't learned that because it's all been blocked. So you always know, I'm doing Pythagorean theorem today. I'm doing simultaneous equations now. I'm doing, it's told you, but on an exam, that's not going to happen.
Exactly. And so let's do a quick recap. We talked about pre-testing, retrieval practice. You talked about interleaving, and spacing is also a desirable
Yes.
difficulty, right? So how does
Right,
that
and-
work?
well, it's a good question, and I don't think we could, even now, I don't think we can give a really good answer because interleaving does introduce spacing.
Yes.
But more, that is, and we've known about spacing for many decades, but often we think of spacing as I do one session studying and then I go off and do unrelated things and I come back. But with interleaving, you create spacing by mixing in the other parts of those materials before you come back to one section. And so on the one hand, they both involve spacing, but interleaving creates some other issues, like is it optimal to interleave things that students tend to be confused about? or are you better to interleave things that are unrelated, you know, than like, you know, so it's, and I think that was an issue that we did a little bit on before we retired, and were we to start our careers all over again. I think that would be a central issue of try to, okay, we know interleaving's powerful in many ways, but what what kinds of things should be interleaved if you want to.
And we do know, people are, teacher students are more easily convinced they should space than that they should interleave. But even spacing can fail if the time between your first exposure to that material and your second exposure to that material is too long.
Yeah.
So that you can't retrieve anything from that first exposure. So sometimes we say to students, if you're spacing, you want to test yourself. If you're testing yourself and then you're waiting and testing yourself again and then testing yourself again, you want that interval to be an interval such that if you waited any longer, you wouldn't be able to retrieve the material from the first session.
But if that's really hard to establish, right?
It's hard to figure out.
Yeah.
So that's where we often say, you teachers are very creative. That's one of your big problems, is to come up with, almost by trial and error, what, for this kind of a material that I'm trying to teach, what is the best spacing that I should use so that I get the maximum, students get the maximum benefit from that.
And we did some research showing that it should be an expanding schedule. So what I mean by that is you try to retrieve after a relatively short delay, but if you succeed there, you can wait a longer delay and it'll be more potent. And if you succeed there, it's still longer. So the interval can expand a great deal and kind of become more powerful each time. But you can't just say, okay, I'll study it and then I'll create a very long interval and have people try to recall it. That won't get you anywhere.
I think there was a Sebastian Leitner, who was a German journalist, created a very interesting system with boxes, So you would like flashcards, and then you would try to retrieve those on the same day. And then the second box you would retrieve on the second day. And as long as you could get the answer right, then you could actually move to the next box, and it would take a little longer for you to do the retrieving. And that seemed to work really well. And today we have apps that can help with that. But still, I think the principle is maintained. It's the more you can space things out, as long as you can remember every time you retrieve, the better, apparently, right?
Yeah. No, that's right. That's a good point. Yeah.
Yeah. And what would you say? I mean, we're moving towards the end, of this conversation. I could spend the whole day talking to you about this amazing research, but what would you say is the biggest obstacle today for teachers and students? Let me give you one piece of information, a context here. AI, generative AI nowadays, ChatGPT, for example, is actually making things a lot easier for students because of cognitive offloading. So basically, instead of writing an essay, they would write a prompt on ChatGPT and then get the essay done entirely by the artificial intelligence. So there's no learning happening there, right? Does that concern you at all? What might happen if students keep using those apps and artificial intelligence and things like that?
Certainly does. I mean, I think a few people have used things constructively, like instead of you being asked to answer some question that you can just steal one person's get good results. I'm forgetting who did this actually, but you're to critique, you're given the chat GPT answer this. And you are to write sort of critique it. What did it not get into? What did it, and so there may be some ways to combine these.
Because one thing one mistake the artificial intelligence created essays often do, is they cite research that it's there in their database and they are able to retrieve it, but it's not actually relevant or all that relevant to what the topic of the essay is. And
they hallucinate as well. They create research that doesn't exist, Yeah.
Exactly. Right.
Yeah.
I want to recommend you to a colleague of mine. Her name is Iris Furstenberg. She's there at UCLA. We taught a big research methods course together. And, with the research methods course, students did an experiment, then they had to write it up, and that was part of the grade. And now they can just, do it all by asking chat. Here's what we had to do. What does it mean? Kind of thing. Yeah. So she has had to face that problem. I had kind of left teaching that course before this problem arose, or just as it was arising. And I just had a brief chat with her, and it seemed like she and her colleagues have worked out a way to handle that problem. So it might be somebody you'd like to talk to.
Definitely. I'd love to talk to. Yeah.
Your
colleague, because I read a paper that came out a couple of weeks ago or a few days ago, MIT, and it showed 3 different groups using ChatGPT. The second group was using Google search, and the other group just used their brains, just their prior memory. And what happened that was really interesting is that the group that used ChatGPT wrote very, academically sound essays, grammatically correct, and all of that. But then when they were asked to quote what they had written, they couldn't remember anything. Or 83% basically couldn't remember a single line of what they had written because they didn't write anything. ChatGPT wrote for them, right? And they just read it afterwards one time, and of course they couldn't remember anything. So that's exactly what you're talking about, So if it's too easy, you're not really learning because you should add desirable difficulties there, right? Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, perfect. Well, we're now approaching the end, so I just wanted to ask a final question. Do you think it is really possible for teachers, instructors, educators to look at desirable difficulties and implement those in the way they teach so that they can help students learn better? Because oftentimes I hear people say, how am I going to interleave in class? As you said, it's a challenge, but is it possible for us to use all those desirable difficulties to help our students?
Yes. Yeah. We're very convinced, of course, we're a little bit biased to start with, but but what's been more convincing in a way is we've been written to by teachers.
Yeah.
One teacher, for example, in area of Alabama, a struggling school district, implemented these things that his kids did wonderfully well on the advanced placement test.
Wow.
And even at higher levels, a law school instructor in Florida, one of the law schools in Florida, implemented across the whole curriculum that is desirable difficulties in very way. And on the what do they call that law exam, Elizabeth? The bar exam.
Yeah.
They went from 4th place years before, compared to other law schools in the state of Florida, to 1st place.
Wow.
Like 3 years in a row, even though the entering credentials of their students was not as high as it was those other schools. So that one is always really because it shows to some degree optimizing instruction can make up for some of the disadvantages that students may bring. I mean,
Yeah.
you'd like to think, given the kind of variation there is of let's say, students in the early grades, what they're getting at home and so on, that if you can just optimize everything you're doing, you can make up for some of those differences.
Yeah.
That's a very hopeful kind of thing.
And such a low cost intervention if you think about it,
Yeah.
because you don't have to invest in infrastructure or digital tech or anything like that. It's really about your instruction and how students
Yes.
study, right? Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, and yeah, the student.
I think
Yeah, there's other examples. We can't take too much time here at the winner, but we've become very convinced, not just by the results we have seen ourselves, but simply the what you've heard back from people in the trenches, so to speak,
Yeah.
about what they've been able to accomplish.
somebody
Yeah,
should take
amazing.
a challenge of creating a sort of repository in the
Mhm.
world of
Yeah.
and where teachers could access. I'm having trouble teaching, my subject algebra, and this. What have other students? What have other teachers done to incorporate desirable difficulties? And they could find it at that site, but I don't. That's it.
That's an amazing idea, maybe a desirable difficulties, best practices website or
Yeah.
something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah. Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Professor Robert Bjork and Elizabeth Bjork. It's been a pleasure. As I was saying at the beginning, I've read so many of your papers as a student of educational psychology at the University of Bristol that I had no idea I would be talking to you someday. So, I'm really honored you accepted my invitation. And I'm sure a lot of our listeners, the listeners of this podcast will benefit a lot from our chat today. And hopefully they will start the best practices forum or something like that to help teachers from all over the world. So thank you again. It was a pleasure.
Yeah. And thanks to you for creating this kind of podcast to reach a broader audience than our articles do.
Well, thank you. My pleasure. Thank you, Elizabeth. It was an honor.